at this heart, is this a way for government to take more control of Manx Radio?
No. Not at all. Going back to January this year, there was a Tynwald motion about Manx Radio and about particularly public service broadcasting, and the entire Tynwald was behind a commitment towards it. And we've seen today, with the broadcast you've done in terms of the bad weather and the travel disruption, how important that is for the island. But the committee was set up to look at the delivery model, the funding, and also the current licence conditions. And that's what we've done with this second and final report, particularly look at the delivery model and the funding of public service broadcasting, not just Manx Radio, but the way that the members of the public get some of the important news that you've been talking about this morning.
Well, in terms of funding, you're suggesting there's a suggestion of more of a BBC model, but you're also suggesting more intervention from Treasury. Isn't that a contradiction to have, even in a small way, controlled by government? Isn't that a state-run media outlet when, in fact, you need a public service broadcaster, which is a completely different thing?
Not at all. I'd encourage people to have a look at the report. It's available on the Tynwald website and also in the Tynwald Library. And obviously what we're looking at here is a set of recommendations which will come forward to Tynwald, hopefully in December, when we hope that we can debate both the first and this last report to look at how we fund public service broadcasting. I think you're right that there is at the moment a difference in terms of what Manx Radio do, what the Communications Commission do, and the funding from Treasury, and also the intervention from the BBC. And we'd like to see that far clearer. What we'd like to do with our recommendations is trigger a debate in Tynwald to see how we go on to actually recognise the importance of public service broadcasting, recognise the importance of editorial independence for that, which is very, very important, but also look at the funding. Because I think on the Isle of Man there's definitely an impression that people here are paying twice for public service broadcasting, once through the TV licence fee to the BBC, and secondly in terms of the taxpayers' money which is being used for the subvention for Manx Radio.
So to make that clearer, so people don't feel like they're paying for BBC and public service broadcasting, you'd like to see them pay for one and not the other?
It's not what I'd like to see. It's the recommendations here. We've got 4 different recommendations in terms of our future relationship with the BBC. This isn't a pick and mix, but it's giving a clear mandate for Tynwald to debate this later on in the year, to see exactly what we'd like to see as the representatives of the Manx people. And I'd encourage people to read the report and to get in contact with their MHKs, because I think this debate is very important, and it's important that it takes place on the floor of Tynwald, not necessarily online or on phone-ins for various radio stations around the country. OK,
well, with that debate with the BBC then, taking one or the other is the option, is the debate that you're putting forward. So is taking the BBC out of the Isle of Man a realistic option, take away all their national TV because they want local service broadcasting?
I think it's certainly an option. We've discussed this both with the BBC and also with the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport in the United Kingdom. I think possibly for far too long on the Isle of Man, we've held on to various traditions because we've always done it that way. I think Manx Radio has sort of adopted the status of a bit of a national treasure, which is very, very important for the people of the Isle of Man. But I also think that it's the committee's job to challenge some of these assumptions and give recommendations that can then lead to a far wider and hopefully more creative debate on the floor of Tynwald.
Has the committee explored what the media landscape would be like without Manx Radio? Because that's what would happen if recommendations are approved.
We've looked at the various scenarios that could happen in terms of public service broadcasting, how the funding is spread out more widely and how it can encourage different people to provide different forms of public service media, because that was one of the other important considerations, that although we're talking about broadcasting and radio, as Manx Radio itself has found, people now are accessing public service media in a much wider variety of ways, including Facebook, social media, online. And we think that that should be further explored, particularly because our remit was looking at the way public service media was delivered across the island.
You've in the recommendation you're talking about, you want to completely redefine public service broadcasting. How can government suggest such a monumental change to the very foundations of broadcasting with no expert in the industry on this committee?
Well, it's not government suggesting. This is a committee, a select committee set up by Tynwald. When we're looking at some of these assumptions, we're looking at why we're still tied to a definition invented by Lord Reith at a time when there was one radio station and one TV station later on, which was the BBC. And now we're looking at a time where certainly my children access public service media online. They don't listen to the radio. They very rarely watch live TV. And surely we should look at that definition again and debate it, whether it's still relevant.
Well, nevertheless, shouldn't there be an industry expert on the committee then looking at that and not no expertise?
This was a Tynwald committee set up by elected representatives. We gathered in a huge amount of evidence from various people across the industry, not just from Manx Radio, but from other radio stations on the island and from other people involved in media on the island. And again, if you look at some of the annexes to the reports, there's a huge amount of documentation there, including submissions from Manx Radio looking through our previous report and criticising it step by step. I think that's perfectly acceptable. But what this report is doing is presenting recommendations that will then be debated on the floor of Tynwald, and hopefully then we can move on, because I think there is a real desire to get things right with public service media on the Isle of Man. That will involve Manx Radio, obviously, but also we need to look at other channels for delivering that.
You've recommended the role should be to only inform and educate and focus on culture news and Manx language programming. That leaves us with the most expensive elements of our output. We'd need many more hours of every day to replace the lost entertainment element. Where are you going to find the millions that would cost in extra funding? Because removing advertising revenues leaves us with a 60% cut in our current income.
Well, again, I'm here this morning not to debate the entire report. That will happen on the floor of Tynwald. We're not saying that Manx Radio shouldn't provide entertainment. What we're doing is defining that core public service media, which is really important to people, and particularly on a day like this, really informs people about what's happening on their island. And that's one of the intrinsic parts of, certainly of Manx Radio. That's how it's grown up, that's how it's developed, and that's how it's funded by government. So we're looking at the use of taxpayers' money to make sure that that's still fit for purpose.
Just finally then, really, with it, in that suggestion that it's so imperative in terms of local community-based broadcasting, why is this BBC role being considered when they've already said they don't want a station over here? They don't want that kind of involvement. They haven't got the money to do the input that they do in places like Jersey and Guernsey. And in fact, that would be at the cost of the BBC and the UK taxpayers, when in fact, as you're saying, the absolute important part of this is that it is local.
That's very true. One of the recommendations points out that at the moment the people on the Isle of Man pay 4.8 million to the BBC to provide services for them, and we think that should be looked at again. We think with our recommendations that there should be a debate on the floor of Tynwald about that to make sure that's still relevant today.
Well, just finally, we could go on for a long time, I'm sure, on this, but you alluded to it earlier, but Manx Radio was often seen, as you said, as a national treasure. What's happened to the pride in Manx Radio? Because this has all turned into money debate for a long time now.
You're quite right. There has been an ongoing debate about the financial basis of Manx Radio, its use of advertising and its use of a public subvention as well. Every couple of years, this comes up for debate on the floor of Tynwald, as it should do, because we're talking about the use of taxpayers' money. This is another report, another committee looking into it at a different time and a different place. And I hope the recommendations that we've presented in the report that was published yesterday and which is available online actually give a clear direction for the debate on the floor of Tynwald, so we can try to put this to rest, we can try to move forward and try to make sure that the representatives of the people of the Isle of Man actually provide and deliver the public service media that they need and also want.